Hey, good morning everybody. So I'm out here on the Specialized Diverge, which is a bike that I recently rebuilt. This is a 2021 Sport Carbon model, and it's really the bike that I started this channel on. It's been sitting as a frame for quite some time, so I figured it was time to, breathe some new life into it, as Old Shovel would say. Got it built up with the Craft Wheelworks GX36 carbon rims, some older Rene Hurst Oracle Ridge 700C by 48 tires. I'm running the Ritchie Butano handlebars, which I actually really like. The saddle is stock, but I am running Russ's prototype manual 27.2 dropper, and there's just a lever which gives you 4 or 5 different positions of drop. Now the one I've got here is just a prototype, and I think Russ and Laura are trying to release this thing in a silver colorway, which is very on brand for Pathless Pedaled. I think it'll be a really cool product. Ooh, getting a little steep here. Gosh, give me a second. Cranks are your pretty standard GRX. I've got these in 165mm with a 40-tooth chainring running 1x. Then of course the title of the video, the Groupset, is the Wheeltop EDS GeX gravel group set, which is something that I've been testing out recently, and in this video a review on this group set, including all the things that I like and dislike. So for starters, Wheeltop is a Chinese brand, and they've been selling electronic group sets for road bikes and mountain bikes for the past few years, and then just recently they released their GeX quote-unquote gravel specific group set. So what you get in the box are a pair of fully wireless shifters as well as a rear derailleur. You also get a charging cable that goes with it, and then in the second box you get the brakes. So a lot of the Wheeltop systems will offer a electronic group set, but either a hydraulic disc brake or a mechanical rim brake option. In my case here, I've got the hydraulic disc brakes. Of course, you get both calipers. The calipers come with brake hose already attached. You also get a couple of flat mount rotor adapters for running various rotor sizes on your bike, and then you get a handful of barbs and olives, and in my case here they even included a very rudimentary bleed kit. Now one of the things I really like about the brakes that are included is that it's mineral oil based, which is just a lot cleaner than the more caustic dot fluid that SRAM uses. It's also compatible with standard Shimano brake pads, which is really nice. Basically whatever pads will fit like your typical GRX brake caliper will fit the new Wheeltop calipers as well. As far as specs for the drivetrain, this is a completely wireless setup. Unlike Shimano, which we call semi-wireless, there's a coin battery in each shifter, and then one rechargeable battery in the rear derailleur. And the way to charge that, of course, is the really long charging cable that comes in the box. Started cold. So the headline feature of the Wheeltop stuff is that it's really open-ended. You can program this thing to shift through a 3-speed cassette, if that even exists, all the way up to a 14-speed cassette, which is probably on its way. So because of that, it's really versatile, which means you can put this on many different bikes with different gearing setups, and it'll basically be compatible with any drivetrain. Right now I've got it set up with a 40-tooth front chainring and a Shimano 11-speed 11 to 51 tooth cassette, I believe. The shifters are actually really small and compact given that this is a hydraulic brake setup. I think the overall design leans way more toward like a Shimano Di2 type shifter rather than a SRAM style shifter. The ergonomics are actually pretty good. For the 1x setup, on the right shifter you get 2 buttons, and then on the left you get a single button. These are actually all programmable, but out of the box it's set up so that the right side small button will give you a harder gear, the right side big button will give you an easy gear, and then the left side button will also give you a harder gear. The form factor is pretty good. One thing I really like about all of the Wheeltop stuff is that there's very minimal branding on it. So it's basically all black with a couple of like embossed EDS TX logos, and then like a really subtle TX logo. And the same could be said about the derailleur as well. It's basically just one minimal GEX logo that's on the derailleur. One thing I will say is that if you have smaller hands, you might have a little bit of trouble with the reach. There is a reach adjustment screw, but out of the box it's set up so that the reach is as short as possible. And even in this shortest reach configuration, it's still a little bit of a stretch for me, and I would say average size hands. You could probably mess around with the ergonomics a little bit by changing the position of the shifter on the bars, but as I've got them set up here, one thing I did notice is that the reach does feel a tad bit long even in its shortest setting. One of the things I mentioned in my last Wheeltop video for the 2x setup is that the hoods are really stiff. They're not the same like pliable rubber hoods that you'd find on like a SRAM or a Shimano hood. It's a much more like plasticky, like stiffer rubber material, and while riding it's actually fine. It feels pretty good. There's a nice tack to it. but the stiffness of the hood makes it really hard to peel them back to access like the pinch bolt or to access the battery slot, which is in the top of the shifter. So one thing I definitely like to see is for the hoods to be a little bit more pliable. Maybe just refine that material a little bit, and I think it'd be great. As far as construction, yeah, there is a little bit of like clickiness in the shifters, but you know, when I compare it to like a Shimano 105 Di2, even those shifters have a little bit of click to them. You can see here, like even if you're not pushing the button, there's a little bit of play in the shifters before you actually click anything. And as you're rumbling down a gravel trail, sometimes you can actually hear that kind of vibration of those like plasticky shift levers. And then last thing, of course, I'll mention is the weight. This is a relatively small shifter, so it feels really good in the hand. It doesn't weigh a lot. It's definitely on par with like a Di2 or an Axis shifter as far as weight goes. Moving back to the rear derailleur now, I think it's actually very refined. It's very similar in design to like a SRAM GX Axis type derailleur. It almost has that same aesthetic to it. It is a clutched derailleur. There's some marketing stuff on the website about like some damping built in. I didn't really notice any benefit from that. What I did notice is that the chain tension is pretty tight. I have not dropped the chain, and I haven't heard any chain slap. So whatever sort of proprietary clutch mechanism they have in this derailleur works really well. As far as the build quality, I'd say it's really good. There's nothing that really stood out to me as like a problem or like a potential problem. The weight of this derailleur is about 400 grams, which if you compare it to like a SRAM Axis GX derailleur is actually a little bit lighter. I believe the SRAM Axis GX setup with a battery installed is something on the order of 450 grams. Don't quote me exactly on that. What I am trying to say is that the weight of this rear derailleur is about the same, if not slightly less, than competing products on the market. All right, so now I do have to talk about setup, because that's probably the biggest gripe that I have about the entire group set. Setup of the shifting in particular. It's not that it's necessarily tricky, I just think there's a couple of things that could be refined to make it a lot simpler to do. But first, you've got to download the Wheeltop app, which is expected. And then once you download it, you've got to create an account, give them some of your information, which I'm not a huge fan of. And then you've got to pair the shifters and the derailleur to your phone. That part was actually very straightforward. It paired right away with no issues. Once you're paired, you'll get some information like the battery level of both the shifters as well as the derailleur. But more importantly, this is where you can actually set up the shifting. So again, this is capable of running 3 to 14 speeds. So the first step is to choose the number of cogs on the cassette. Obviously, I chose 11 speed. And then it basically takes you through a series of setup steps. So the next step is what's called initial calibration. This is basically setting up the indexing. So you'll put the chain in the smallest cog, and then you make fine adjustments until that is, running smoothly. And then once you've got that initial index kind of set up, then you've got to go through each gear and you can fine tune the trim on each cog of the cassette. Now this is probably the part that to me was the most frustrating, and I kind of complained about this in my earlier video on the road group set. So basically, if you're in a particular cog and you notice that it needs to be trimmed inboard or outboard, you basically just have to hit a plus or minus button on the phone app. But the real kicker is that it doesn't update in real time. So what you have to do is to kind of just press it a few times, and then you've got to shift up and then back down to realize that change, and then kind of repeat that process from there. Now it's like a minor inconvenience, but when you multiply that across, however many cogs on the cassette, and if you're like me, you want to get things nice and lined up pretty perfectly, each cog might take a few cycles to get perfect, just because those integer values don't have any physical meaning. It's just like a numerical index. And so there's really no intuition for how many times to push the button. But anyways, once you do get all of the gears kind of fine-tuned, which again is the longest part in my experience of the setup process, then you're done. Like, there's nothing else you have to do. You're good to ride at that point. For me, from start to finish, that means from opening the box to installing all the components, to setting up the drivetrain and bleeding the brakes, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The entire process from start to finish probably took me like 2.5 hours, which doesn't sound like that much time, but a big chunk of that 2.5 hours was spent kind of begrudgingly fuddling around with the fine-tuning of the rear cassette. So again, if there's one thing that I would change about the setup process of all of the Wheeltop stuff, is that just incorporate a slightly more refined setup process, and I think it would just save a lot of headache. Now fortunately, on the braking side, setup really couldn't have been easier. It's really straightforward. The hoses were already pre-attached and pre-filled. Basically, you just run the hoses through the frame, or however you're going to run the hoses, and then you clip the hoses at the proper length, It comes with the proper olives and barbs that you need to set up with these particular shifters. And in my case, I just kind of took my time. I was pretty careful about it. I believe the shifters come pre-filled as well. So as long as you're not dropping a ton of fluid in the setup process, for me, I just hooked up the hoses to the shifters and I was good to go. The lever feel is really nice. There's no squishiness to the brakes. You have a really strong initial bite, which is somewhat different from a SRAM setup, which to me feels a little bit squishier. I personally like the more digital on-off feeling of the Shimano brake, and the Wheeltop system is very familiar to me. Now, something that's actually a big change from the previous generation Wheeltop stuff is that they've updated the brake calipers. So one of my biggest complaints about the earlier Road 2x Groupset is that the brake calipers just kind of felt like an afterthought. It definitely felt like a first version of a brake caliper. They're really boxy. The finish wasn't that great. Functionally, they worked pretty well, but aesthetically, they kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. Now, fast forward to the release of the GEX Groupset. The calipers are like really nice looking. They're a lot more compact. I think they weigh a little bit less, and the overall finish is a lot nicer as well. All right, so zooming out a bit, looking at this system as a whole, in early 2025, you can get this entire group for like $560 directly off the Wheeltop website. One thing I like about Wheeltop is that they feel like a very established company. Even though they exist overseas, they've got pretty good distribution. They've got an actual warranty procedure, although I haven't actually needed to warranty anything, so I don't exactly know what that process is like. What I do know is that they're actually responsive. So if you just email the company, a real person will eventually message you back, which is kind of nice. When you compare the $560 price tag to like a SRAM setup of equivalent spec, obviously this is going to be half or maybe even a third the cost, which is very attractive. And then if you look at the Shimano side, there actually doesn't exist an equivalent system yet. It feels like everybody's waiting on like a wide-ranging 1x Shimano Di2 system, but it just hasn't dropped yet. So companies like Wheeltop, I feel like, are taking advantage of that gap, and they've kind of beat Shimano to the punch here. For me, it feels like it takes the best of both Shimano and SRAM systems and kind of combines them together into one affordable group set. Now, of course, this is personal, but for me, what I mean by that is that you have a mineral oil-based braking system with a Shimano-y brake lever feel, if that makes any sense. But something that I dislike about the Shimano electronic group sets is that it's not fully wireless. So the Di2 setups, currently you've got a centralized battery that lives in the seat tube, and then you've got electronic power wires that run to the front and rear derailleur. So it does take a little bit more to set up the Shimano systems. Something I really like about the SRAM systems is that they are completely wireless, which the Wheeltop has adopted. So fully wireless shifters, fully wireless derailleurs. It's just really easy to set up. Obviously, I also really like the price tag. I really don't think you can beat $560 for this level of spec. Through my testing so far, there's no issues with it. The shifting is very precise. Obviously, because it's electronic, you can fine-tune the trim for every individual cog. And if you take the time to do that, the shifting is absolutely perfect. As far as braking, the brake power is there. It's every bit as strong as like a GRX brake caliper. Modulation-wise, again, it feels very similar to a Shimano brake. And overall, I've had zero issues functionally with this group set. Now, speaking to battery life, one of the gripes about the Wheeltop stuff is that even though the shifters sort of adopt the SRAM style of fully wireless group set, you don't have a detachable battery. So SRAM wireless setups, you've got a common battery that will power front derailleur, rear derailleur, electronic seat post if you've got that option. It's just one battery and it works on all the components, which is pretty nice. So far, we haven't seen that from the Wheeltop stuff. I don't know if it's a patent thing or what, but all of the Wheeltop derailleurs have an integrated battery, which is rechargeable, but not removable. So for me, it hasn't been an issue yet. I haven't drained a battery yet. I tend to shift a lot when I ride, but I don't have any data to back up like how many shifts I've actually gone through per like percentage of battery life. So at the moment, I can't speak honestly about battery life. Maybe I'll do like a longer term update if you're curious. What I will say is that after a few rides of pretty high shift volume, the battery level is still pretty high. It's in the 70s or 80s. So if I had to estimate, I would say maybe I've got to recharge it every I don't know, a few hundred miles. But again, that's total speculation. I'll give you some actual numbers after a longer term review, either in the comments down below or in a separate video. All right, so I know that was just a high density review, a lot of information. Try to keep it somewhat organized and just give you my honest thoughts on my experience with this group set so far. As the channel grows and gets a little bit bigger and reaches a slightly larger audience, I'm starting to get a little bit more heat in the comments about, you know, it's not an unbiased review, they gave you the product, yada yada. So yes, in full transparency, Wheeltop did send this group set out to the channel for review. Other than the product, there was no money that changed hands. Wheeltop has not seen this video before it went live, nor did they have any input as to its content. In all my reviews, I try and remain as impartial as possible, present the facts, present my experiences. But if you have any suggestions as to how these reviews can improve, be less biased if that's at all possible, definitely feel free to put those as constructive criticisms down below in the comments section. So I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions about my experience so far with the Wheeltop EDS GeX 1x gravel group set, you can just leave those down in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond to as many as possible. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.